Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another great SPREE seminar. Today we have with us Chris Amos. Chris has more than 20 years of experience in the energy sector, first working in pricing, of energy, and then moved to distribution of energy. And he's today going to talk about economics of microgrids and the challenges of distributed generation. So please welcome Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. I did my first degree here at University of New South Wales, so I'm very pleased to be back here again. My apologies, I was meant to update the title of the presentation, but you're in the right place. I am going to be talking about the kind of challenges of transitioning to distributed generation. This presentation has been to a mixed audience, so I do apologise if I'm sort of talking well below your kind of level, but I think it's good to just refresh some of the kind of basics so we can be on the same page. You've seen this all before. This is the kind of network system that we've got today. Centralised generation, big transmission set network, 500, 330 kV in New South Wales in particular, and then the sub-transmission distribution. It's basically the way I have been thinking about it in the last 6 months is this, in a lot of ways, functions like a giant machine. Everything needs to be coordinated and needs to kind of hang together. And the more that I've thought about it, it does function like one giant machine, and it's basically why we need frequency control, because it all has to hang together. Probably the other obvious thing that you guys are aware of is the supply and demand must perfectly match all the time. Historically, stockpiling of electricity has been very expensive and not really that feasible. And as a result, we have the network that we have today, which is centralised generation and all the frequency control that needs to go with that. As a function of that, we have a lot of redundancy as well. Because of the nature of that supply-demand balance, you need to have a lot of redundancy so that if you do have an outage on one element, you need to be able to compensate for that very quickly, hence why you have a lot of redundancy. The other aspect you need to be aware of is scale. This has all been driven by what economists call scale economies, where the bigger things get, the cheaper they get. That idea is really fundamental to what's happening in terms of transformation of the industry today and over the next 20 years. That scale economy is, I think, starting to fall away. So keep that in mind as we go through this conversation. The other factor in that scale problem is when you're an investor sitting in an investment bank and somebody comes to you and says, we want to replace, I'll give you an example, Liddell, for example, that's 2,000 megawatts of capacity, and we'll get a return on that. What's the lifetime? 40 years. And how much money do you want? I don't know, $1.2, $1.3 billion for that investment. An investor's going to look at that and go, you know what, that's too risky for me, I don't think I'll bother. And that's one of the key problems of private investment with large-scale generation that we're seeing in Australia at the moment. Obviously, particularly acute with the debate about the carbon price as well. Again, this is just kind of taking you through the complexity of the way the market operates today. Probably the one thing I want to kind of relay to you is you can see what is very manifest in this is that it is centralised. The coordination is from top to bottom, and I'll take you through it. You've got the generation at the top there, you've got the retail market, and you've got the pool sitting in the middle. We have what's called a gross market in Australia, so all the generation must go through the pool. And then we have a set of bilateral supply contracts that sit out the side, which are kind of differencing contracts. So if something gets sold at $40 a megawatt hour and the strike price in the market ends up being 35, there's a $5 difference payment made between the generator and the retailer in their strike contract. So in that way, everything goes through the market. The physical supply obviously goes through the physical pathway, but the financial market is more complex than that, because we like making it complex, why not? The supply goes to the customer and the dollars go through to the retailer. Then the retailer then has to pay their supply contracts, and quite often they've got their own generation, so they're effectively just covering their own costs. But then there's also a payment from the retailer to the distributor, which is where I used to work, Ausgrid, and I worked in pricing, so I know this stuff backwards. If you want to ask any questions, please don't, because I'm sick of it. No, ask questions. And then the distributor, in this case Ausgrid, it's the example that I was, pays the transmission company. I don't know what else to say there. The transmission pricing is meant to be nodal in its price signalling, which is meant to signal congestion. And the idea is it's meant to provide some kind of nodal pricing to locate generation, which it tends not to do. And the distribution pricing is what we call top to bottom pricing. It's meant to signal long run marginal cost. Doesn't really do that very well. That's a whole other conversation. How would a microgrid fit within that model? The national electricity rules basically are structured around this. Microgrids, isolated microgrids or semi-autonomous microgrids don't really have a place in that model. They don't really have a place in the regulatory or the kind of the legal framework, if you like. So I'm just going to pose that question to you and I'll come back to it later. Okay, so I think I've just talked through this already, but yeah, framework assumes top to bottom flows. It does require that a retailer is appointed to each connection point. You must have a retailer because that's the only way you can get supply, right? It's through the market. There are exemption guidelines, so you can have embedded networks, you can have standalone, but that's through an exemption framework. Now, the basic problem that we've got through this framework is that if you want to disconnect and take a whole bunch of customers off the network, the problem that the regulator's got is what kind of market protection has that customer got in terms of price protection? Now, at the moment, they've got that framework with price pressures between retailers bidding for customers. If you physically isolate the customer from that market framework, the protection framework's not there anymore. You're basically a captured customer. And that's the dilemma that the regulator is faced with in terms of giving exemptions. And as I said, we've got to build a lot of redundancy on the basis of peak usage. I will say there is a rule change going through from Western Power at the moment, and they're looking to basically have parts of the network that are connected to the main network, and then they can hive them off and say, well, let's say they were coming up to an investment decision where they had to replace a large piece of feeder, and it was going to cost a lot of money. And they've got a real option now of isolating that piece of infrastructure and actually supplying it as a microgrid because that's economically more cheaper. The current legal framework doesn't even contemplate that at the moment, and so that's why they're putting a rule change request in. It's always been the working assumption that customers would connect to the main grid. In fact, maybe even in our kind of mental lifetime in the last 40 or 50 years, say Victoria, there were a lot of country towns that when they finally connected to the grid, that was a massive event. And now we're talking about reversing that out. So there's a whole psychology around that as well. If we come along and decided to kind of cut someone off from the main grid, there's a whole psychology that we're going to have to deal with as well. It's not just economics. Possible future, again, this is for another audience. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this kind of stuff. What I do want to posit is the idea that we don't really have a real good fixed definition of what a microgrid is. Now, I don't mean to be flippant there, but there's arguments about the size and how small they get, and then we're starting to talk about nanogrids as well. And I think this is a fluid concept, and I think it's going to keep developing, and it's basically going to be you guys that are going to kind of answer the question for us. But that's a possible microgrid. And I still want to posit the idea they could potentially be connected to the grid, but they have some degree of independence. That's what I'm starting to think. So I'm not thinking complete isolation. I am thinking interconnectedness, but I'm starting to think light interconnectedness. And I'll come to that more. Okay, I just want to posit an idea for you. What if in, say, 30 to 40 years time from now, we've got enough dispersed batteries and generation, of course, in the grid such that you don't need centralised generation. In fact, you get to such a point where you could completely turn off the main grid for, say, 5-6 hours, and the main grid can kind of self-supply 5-6 hours. You don't need N-2 redundancy in your transmission network at that point, because that's kind of the roughly mean time to recovery. by and large, when you have a failure. So you could potentially go, okay, we could do n-1. You can see with that kind of thought experiment, now I'm not suggesting that is the topology we're going to go to, but you can see with that thought experiment, what I can see happening is you can have a much more lightly loaded transmission network. And in fact, if you push that further, you can start to ask the question, do we need centralised dispatch? The supply paradigm shifts, right? Now we're going to have whole pile of different kind of scenarios, and I don't know which one we're going to get. But I think it's useful to have that kind of thought experiment and to start to see, well, we're going to be somewhere in the mix there, and we're going to need some kind of technical solution and economic solution to kind of make that hang together. And that obviously raises the question about network and retail business models as well. Particularly as a network business model, I will come back to this, but I have increasingly formed the view that I think both the network and the retail businesses are in the line of fire in terms of the new paradigm. I used to, being a network business, I used to think it was just the retailers, but I have got to a point now where I think networks are at risk as well. This is a bit of a detour, but just a bit of a pet topic of mine. This is data of load on the Ausgrid network, and this was from sort of around 1999 to around 2006. And we just collapsed. It's just all the bulk supply point data going from all the way through, every single data point. And then what we've done is we've also had a look at the regional reference price. So that is the strike price at the 132 kV bar at Sydney West. That's where the market is notionally settled in New South Wales. We actually have 5 or 6 markets in the NEM. We call it an electricity national market, but it's actually sub-markets. So, and then what we've done, we've compared when we've had the constraints on the network with the constraints by definition in the peak pricing, the regional reference price, when it's hit what used to be called vol. And when you've done the comparison, we've come down with that blue line there. Now, it's a lot of kind of messy data there, but what you get out of that is that kind of correlation. You can see the R squared. If you've got 0 correlation, the R squared is 0. If you've got perfect correlation, you'd get 1. We've got 0.29, and that's the kind of line of best fit that we've got. The point is, now admittedly the data's a bit old, but I think this still holds. The point is the correlation between peak price for the network and the constraints on the wholesale market don't relate to each other. You're thinking, well, how's that possible? The wholesale constraint prices are supply side driven. You have a generator that falls over, all of a sudden you've got a supply side constraint, and then the price goes up. So it tends to be more supply side constrained than it is on network and demand side driven. What that means is you can't readily create a price structure, like an integrated price structure for a retail customer, and actually do a good job of hitting the network constraints through peak pricing and the retail constraints through wholesale congestion at the same time. You can only really do one or the other, not both at the same time. There's a bit of a whinge of mine that I had with the regulator in price setting, so I won't bore you any further with that. But that does that's another little piece in the puzzle in terms of how we're going to make all this hang together. Pricing is another important element. Probably another point that I'd like to make, just kind of as a comment about the industry, and I'm not suggesting it's this audience, but certainly within my industry, there is a tendency that engineers kind of don't want to have, or they almost take pride in not knowing anything about economics or finance, or there's actually an accounting class after this. I just want to reinforce that we need to be more polymath in our thinking, and we need to get our heads around, and I am speaking as an engineer at this point, we need to get our head around, and I'm not trained in economics by the way, so you can just disregard everything I'm saying, but we do need to get our head around economics, finance, marketing, consumer behaviour, because the whole thing hangs together. We need each other, and I probably want to encourage you to kind of work with the business school and work with the economic school in terms of trying to resolve these really, really important problems. Again, this is just a little take on how now I'm speaking as a network business here. Now, part of the problem is my expertise is in network, and retail is really quite a different market. So you almost need a parallel person here talking retail, which I can't do as well as them. Basically, the way network businesses operate, we have a legal obligation to supply. It's in the legislation in New South Wales. I'm sure it's in every other jurisdiction. That means when someone comes along and says, we want to connect to your network, We don't sit there as a business and go, well, it's not really in our economic interest to do so. Go talk to person X. We have a legal obligation to connect them, which means we have, at some level, an obligation to invest in the network to supply. That's why we have a licence to do so in New South Wales. What that means is I'm going to use exaggerated language here, we're basically forced to build infrastructure. Now, I know that's a bit laboured, gold plating and all of that, but what it does mean, okay, there's kind of, say this is what we had to invest and there's gold plating up here. There's still this investment here. Now, if we find that load falls off, it's not good enough to just say, oh, well, stiff shit. You're just going to lose all that money. Because it's a different, so I'm just defending networks here, but it is a different paradigm to what it is to be in a competitive marketplace where you get options in terms of risk trade-off there. We don't have the same kind of risk. Now, it is true that the rate of return covers some of that risk, but my argument would be that rate of return did not contemplate this kind of transformative effect. So we either do two things. We either have some kind of off-ramp if the volume falls off, or we start ramping up the rate of return to cover that future risk. But this diagram is just off the AR website, but basically the way we build an asset, say it's $100, then we recover the asset value over 40 years. We get a rate of return on the value of that asset. We depreciate it over that 40-year period, straight line depreciation. It's really simple. And we get depreciation, a bit of rate of return, we get a tax benefit, and we get efficient OPEX as well. And that's what the regulator has to do every 5 years. They come and have a look at our RAB, what's called regulated asset base. They also look at our future expenditure in terms of capital and OPEX. And we have this massive argument about rate of return. And we come up with that, and that's our cash flow for the next 5 years. And we do it again in 5 years' time. This is...
So, Chris, do you take questions midway through?
Yeah, sure.
Can we just go back on that one? What's the rate of return? You've got absolute dollars there.
So this is just kind of a made-up spreadsheet. But our rate of return is floating around, I think it's around 7.5% or something like that. It's a huge argument.
Yeah, because it just looks, I mean, the return on capital looks large in comparison to everything else. And that's where you might expect someone to criticise such a model to say, hey, you guys are doing pretty well there if the return on capital is such a big chunk of
Yeah. Well, that's exactly why there's this huge argument over the rate of return, because obviously fractions of a percent on that rate of return have a significant bearing. And I mean, when someone comes to do an investment, we're heavily geared. So I mean, our gearing is 60%, but I know some of the Victorians are geared up to 90%. So what that means is, if you tweak, the debt markets tweak a little bit, or the equity markets, particularly the debt markets, are heavily debt funded. If they tweak, then that has a huge bearing on our kind of our return, like our economic return. Yeah, but you're right. Apologies, a bit lazy there. I probably should have put up something more recent. And
I know that's okay. I was just interested to know the percentage return, but maybe I should invest all my money with you guys. And, 7 or 8% sounds pretty good.
Well, Australian Super, they own 49.6% of us now, or them. Yep. It is a blue chip investment. I won't deny that. I'll shut up now. All right, now, you guys, this is just a classic. Don't look at too much of the detail, but basically, this is scale economies, right? So, the reason that we do have a monopoly function is we exhibit scale economies. As things get bigger, the marginal cost goes down. So every additional 100 megawatts that we have to supply, all our fixed costs get spread out, and we get this kind of density where everything goes down a little bit more. And so the long run marginal cost, which is the incremental cost to do the next investment, gets cheaper. It doesn't think about fixed costs. It just says, if I had to build another 100 megawatts of capacity on my, and I'm talking networks here, it's a little cheaper than it was for the previous 100, ignoring the fixed cost. Even if you include the fixed cost or the sunk cost of having been there already, you add them in, you get what's called the long run average cost, which is that curve above there as well. What that means is, and the generation side exhibits this as well, scale economies. This is probably the most significant economic. This is all you need to know if you want to sound like an economist in the power industry. You got this worked out, you can fake your way everywhere. The important thing with this is, and I know I've been talking about network businesses, and the economics of microgrids is pretty simple. You just build it and that's what it costs, right? But it's all tied in with all this sunk cost problem. As soon as you understand that and the connection between the two, everything starts to fall into place. As the cost of solar and batteries and any other kind of hybrid technology comes into play, and who knows what that might be in the future, we start getting down beyond that cost curve there, that long run marginal cost in particular. But even so, if we just get below the long run average cost, we start changing the whole economic paradigm. And that's what we're starting to see now. And this is an aggregate, right? So when we're talking about the economics of the network, we're talking about rural areas, fringe areas, dense areas. So what we will see happen is the microgrids will start to become really viable on the fringe of the grid, and then they'll slowly start to creep in over time as well. The other factor is who is most incentivized to change their behavior? Who experiences the whole value stack, the whole cost stack? The end use customer. It's not the retailer, it's not the network, it's not the generation, it's not the transmission bit. The end use customer sees all of it. So they're the ones that are the most incentivized. And I'm talking business and domestic and large scale customers as well. And inevitably the domestic ones are the ones that experience the highest cost because they're sitting right at the bottom of the network in particular. We do a top to bottom cost allocation. So as you're connected to the network, and again, I'm just talking networks, the further down in the network you are, the more costs you're exposed to, right? So if you're sitting right at the bottom, you have the highest prices and you have the lowest capacity to get kind of bulk discounts as well. So they're the ones that we're starting to see, the residentials and the small commercials. That's why it's going in there first, because they've got the price signal. It's just basic economics. So obviously with this, you need to add the value stack on top of that, which makes the kind of hurdle of investing much easier because there's even more cost, and particularly in New South Wales, when you've got potential. So if Liddell does get put aside, retired, killed, that's a big chunk of generation. The problem with electricity, particularly in New South Wales, is what was Macquarie has about 4,800 megawatts of capacity. So that's it's like a giant rock in a really small pool. The moment you start withdrawing that kind of capacity out of the market, it doesn't quite work, but you can imagine the pool would drop. But in this case, the price would go up, right? And that's part of the dilemma is when you're doing withdrawal of major pieces of capacity in the marketplace, it has quite a significant impact on the price in the market. So if there's two parties that are waiting for the other party to kind of withdraw, they're playing kind of reverse chicken, trying to work out who's going to go first. Because the moment this guy withdraws, the price goes up, they can make the remaining value of the asset more valuable. Anyway, that's another conversation. Finally, microgrids. We're here. What I see happening is a couple of things. One is we're going to see a lot of behaviour that's just going to happen, right? Because the economic driver there for end-use consumers, they're just going to go and they want to save money. They don't care about all this kind of topology. So we're going to see that kind of penetration just happen. And we're just going to have to kind of work with it as we go. But the other thing that I think we're going to see, and we did start seeing this happen. I've got to talk in the past tense with Ausgrid now. I've been there 17 years, so it's going to take a while to get out of me. But people are... Westfields was the classic. They've just microgridded all over the place where they're not disconnecting from the network, but they're basically saying, "Oh, we'll own everything inside inside the mall, and we'll run it." And then they get a bulk price, and then they can put in their own generation, and then they can aggregate all that value and offset. If they can do a demand reduction, they've got it at the gate. They can save money. So we're starting to see this kind of splintering off of our network, admittedly at the fringes, but it is starting to happen. And so what I think is going to start happening is we're going to see that splintering, one at an aggregate level. The other effect is we're going to start seeing it at a very miniaturised level as well. We're going to get productisation. So pumps in rural areas. They're a really good example where, okay, they're small, but you could immediately imagine, if we can get the cost right, instead of building a significant piece of infrastructure to supply the pump, we could do a little kind of microgrid to supply the pump on its own. That becomes a little market. I'm going to start a business which does microgridding for pool pumps, and I know the value proposition for farmers. Another one might be DC supply inside households. What happens now is the economics of AC supply start to get flipped around, right? So I can and I'm sure you guys have done it, you can jump on the internet and there's proponents coming out now that talking about putting DC inside households. Why bother going through the inversion process from your DC supply, which is the solar and battery, through to AC, back round to your device, and then having to do another conversion inside your device? There's a lot of savings potentially there. And so you could have hybrid homes which have both AC and DC. That'll be another productisation. You might have a specialisation where you start selling product solutions to a particular kind of type of business solution. So I can see, and it's feasible, right? No longer you're doing centralised supply, you're getting multiple parties coming in and doing that supply. The other thing I'm going to see happening is we're going to have what I'd call a federation of microgrids. So they're still going to be lightly interconnected, but they're all going to have a degree of autonomy, and they're going to be decentralised. And we were just talking earlier with Jose, I don't think the industry really at large really understands the implication of this. I think probably with electric vehicles and this transformation are probably the two most significant transformations in possibly in energy over the next 20 to 25 years. What am I up to here? I'll go back there. Supply and demand must balance. I've said that already. Central coordination. Yeah, AC mains. Okay, so DC braking is getting a lot easier. I saw a 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt hour battery out of Auckland about 4 months ago. They don't seem to have any problem with the DC braking. They're coordinating with the main system really well. The technology is really stable. They were just short of trying to kind of put a bullet through the battery to try and see it catch on fire, and they couldn't do it. So there's been a lot of concerns about lithium ion and the stability, but out kind of live in the real world, they seem to be very stable and secure. You can't compete with the cost efficiencies achieved with scale economies. I think I've made that point already. The other point was the scale, right? So I made the point, if you're an investor, all of a sudden, and again, I'm telling you what you already know, you don't need to build in chunks of 1,000 megawatts. You can basically do it in very small chunks, which means the risk profile as an investor completely is transformed. And that means that transforms the kind of people that can get into that market as well. Probably the other thing I'd want to make is consumers, despite a lot of talk, are inelastic. Working 10 years in pricing, I can tell you that from experience. They really are not that interested. Batteries change that. Basically, they can still be inelastic in their behaviour, but they can solve the elasticity problem by letting the battery do the hard work for them of trying to shift their usage, among other things, from a pricing perspective. That'd probably be the other point is, us as a network business, we very much have been seeing PV and batteries as an opportunity for peak shaving. I think we need to shift that proposition and say that paradigm is dead. The real issue is accommodating renewables and trying to work out how we transition from a centralised distribution to a decentralised distribution as well. Peak load will be there for a while, but I think the transition is really on how do we accommodate this completely different use of the network. Let me catch up with my notes here. Okay, so yeah, as I've said, the economies of scale are falling away, so that does change things a lot. These dot points, they're just the basic kind of questions that you'd ask yourself with microgrids, so I'm not going to dwell on them too much, but they're the kind of questions that you need to ask yourself. And just to add, I think we're going to continue to see miniaturisation of supply, again, kind of speaking to the choir here. Everything's immensely scalable, and therefore the risk changes. The other point to be made is that the short-run marginal cost of supply from PV is zero, right? I'm talking short-run here. Now, there's a kind of medium-run cost where you need to put in your sunk cost and recover them as well. That does provide an interesting dilemma in how you price that over the longer term. And to be honest, I haven't got my head around that. The other thing is it does muck up the centralised dispatch, because all of this kind of PV and all the wind, because it's all zero cost at dispatch, it makes sense for that economically to get dispatched first. But because of its intermittency, then how do you deal with that and that inertia problem as well? You know, I think you all know that probably batteries is going to be the answer to that. The other thing I was going to add was I think peer-to-peer trading is a natural fit in this space. One idea might be to, when we price electricity, particularly in the network side of things, when you get your bill, you're getting the retail bit, which is the actual cost of the production. You're actually getting a portion for the transmission, which is like a transport cost, and same with distribution. And we tend to smear those costs through the tariffs. How do you price when you've got someone that's generating locally and supplying locally, while at the same time the majority of the network is a top to bottom? Because that's how we price. We price on the network, on the infrastructure side, top to bottom. And that's one of the problems that we're going to have in terms of transitioning between that model. The other way is peer-to-peer, where you just go, well, I'm not really using any of this upstream infrastructure, though I would argue you kind of are, because you're getting the benefits of frequency control, you're getting the benefits of redundancy, a whole raft of other kind of capacity benefits when the wind's not blowing and so on and so forth. But I think we're going to get to a point where we're going to be in a difficult transition point where there's going to be enough inertia, there's going to be enough batteries and solar down at the lower level where if the upstream does disconnect, then you're going to have enough for these guys to kind of supply themselves. At which point there's going to be a big argument about the pricing, because they're not going to want to pay for any of that upstream stuff, all that sunk cost. And that's going to be a difficult conversation that we're going to have. And it's not going to go away. So DC in the home, savings, not saving from multiple transformations, niche local electricity solutions, I've sort of given you a few examples there. I think we will see standalone rural microgrids, that's fairly kind of brainlessly obvious, I think. And federation of microgrids with decentralised control. Now I must apologise, it's not really a particularly technical presentation. And I do recognise that there's a lot of technical issues there and system control kind of issues. The economics is going to drive us. I think that's the kind of message hopefully you're hearing, is this stuff's going to happen and then we're going to have to kind of back solve the kind of technical solution. And there will be a degree at which technically things just can't physically be done. You can't defy physics, right? But you can kind of push it. And I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to start to see problems that we're going to have to solve. And I think we're going to want to solve them, because if we can get these solutions right, then we are going to move towards a kind of decarbonised future. Probably the one thing I would say is I think the economics is going to, just the sheer cost savings is going to drive this more than a carbon tax. I think a carbon tax is going to maybe provide some kind of acceleration there. But what I'm seeing is, in terms of the economic behaviour, is when I have a look at the price increases that we as Ausgrid put through in the last 5 years, the carbon tax that we did have for a short while was not material in compared to the total costs that we lumped on to consumers. And I thought it was amusing the amount of argument that went on, because it had very little impact compared to the total cost. Consumers are therefore responding now to the price increase that is just the basic economics. It's got nothing to do with carbon price. They will continue to do so, and a bit more when we put a carbon tax on it. But at the moment, I think a lot of it's just going to be driven by just the price exposure that they're seeing at the moment. Okay, so how committed is the government to a decentralised dispatch market? Again, you're going to go to a point where you're going to have to you're completely decentralised, you're going to have to dismantle it. When is that moment? And how do you do that transition? You can't do it too early because you're going to need that centralised market for a long while until you've got sufficient capacity in the decentralised. Yeah, you can see the problem there. I haven't got an answer for that. This is where I think things are going to go. We need to think about fracturing up the network business into microgrids and auctioning off capacity. We're going to have to, and I can say this now, we're going to have to pick a fight with the big Ausgrids and other parties, and we'll have a commercial conversation about their sunk costs and them recovering those costs, and we should. But I think there's going to come a point where it's just going to be cheaper to supply someone locally and have all the kind of nuts and bolts at a local level, and maybe have some interconnection between those networks such that you've got sufficient levels of redundancy with peer-to-peer trading, and then you've got the infrastructure there already. So you're going to kind of have to, at some point, reef them off the distribution businesses and sell those access rights. They did it in telco with AT&T in the US. I don't think that there's any reason why we can't do it in electricity as well. Basically break it up into kind of supply areas, start auctioning those off. Okay, it's a separate conversation to getting that sorted out with the current owner. That's a given. And then basically having kind of bidding behaviour where they agree to supply that area for, say, 5, 10, 15... There's multiple models that we could have here, but kind of having these auction markets that maybe kind of run every 10 years or something like that. There'd still need to be some degree of regulation and price control on those. Yeah, so that I think that's a significant potential there, and one pathway that could get us towards that kind of microgrid solution. So yeah, what that means is the retail businesses and the network businesses are in the firing line. We're going to kind of fracture the whole marketplace up and sort of destruct, in some ways, the retail and network businesses as they stand today. And I think both are going to struggle. We're still talking long time frames here. I still expect this is going to take 30 or 40 years. Could be wrong, but it's going to take a while. I won't say too much with this, other than the financing option. At the moment, there's one company called Verdia, and they basically provide an interface service with Westpac. So if you come along and you've got some kind of investment proposal, what they were saying to us was that if you go to NAB or if you go to the Commonwealth, these guys, their bread and butter is working out risk profiles of investments, but they don't know this space. So what do you do if you don't understand risk? You just price the risk into your cost of your debt. What these guys have done is Westpac have recognised this. They've set up this kind of 5 minutes, this business where they'll kind of outsource this company Verdia. You can go there. They'll do the risk assessment of the investment, and they'll say this has this risk profile, it meets the hurdle rate. Westpac go, yeah, we trust these guys. We'll give you a good cost of debt. The other thing is that we're going to start seeing different ownership structures as well. We had conversations with Vector, a New Zealand company coming into Australia trying to look for investment opportunities. They were throwing all sorts of options at us in terms of co-ownership or owning the asset or risk sharing, whole raft of things. That's where it's going to get interesting on the kind of financing and ownership management structures. And then, of course, repayment structures. You pay early, pay late. Where does the investment risk sit? Who's prepared to share with that? And to be honest, from where I'm coming from, I'm just sort of doing my head in trying to think about these models because it's just not a way that we think. Maybe just a sort of a close off. A couple of points I want to make, which I hadn't got to. There's a really important book called The Innovators Dilemma, a guy called Clayton Christensen. I really encourage you to read it. And it's basically sort of given textbook in the business. I'm sure that AGSM, they read it. In it, he talks about what happens in an industry when you get disruption is you usually have another business over here selling a product to, and Clayton basically does it to the disk drive industry, which had multiple turnovers. They went from 20-inch to 8 to 5.25 to 3.5, and then I kind of lost track after that. But it happened over, and all these businesses got chewed up and spat out. And what happened, he analysed that. What he found was that the 3.5-inch guys, when they were just coming into the market, the 5.25 market weren't interested in the product, and they had a fantastic product that it was cheap, it had great potential, and the 3.5 guys, there were some niche applications, but the 5.25s, they weren't interested in that. There wasn't any money in it, and it was a small market. So the 3.5s, they went off, they got into it, the product was expensive, but they had a niche application. And what happened is, over time, they got cheaper, their product life cycle, they improved. And what happened was, by the time, in the S-curve development, by the time the 3.5-inch guys were really improving, the guys on the 5, their kind of efficiency curve was crossing over here, right? By the time this market got big enough for these guys who are big and fat to get interested, it was too late. These guys had taken them off and they ate them up. And Christensen goes through multiple, he goes through disk drive, he looks at the backhoe industry in the 50s, and he also looks at mini mills, of all things. So he used completely different marketplaces and demonstrates the same effect over and over again. I didn't think this stuff was disruptive, but I've changed my mind. I am convinced that it exhibits the same kind of behaviours that Christensen said it did, where PVs in particular, the quality wasn't that good, the costs were high, and it was kind of a niche application. And that's all changing now. And I think what's going to happen is the kind of, you guys are going to come in and you're going to transform the industry from the outside. We are too big. The big retailers, I don't know if you've heard this phrase, but the AGLs and the Ausgrids, we're kind of too big to, they call it too big to fail with the 2008, but I think it's the opposite, where it's kind of too big to succeed. We're conservative, we're risk averse, we're not going to transform the industry. I think the forces need to be external to the industry, and they're going to be disruptive the way Christensen said they were. So I'd encourage you to read that. The other thing that I just wanted to raise with you was another book called Crossing the Chasm, a guy called Geoffrey Moore, another marketing textbook. And he talks about the transition from people who are early adopters to the majority adopters, like the kind of pragmatists. And he said they're different markets. So you can imagine that you've got the innovators at the front, early adopters, and then the large majority adopters, and then the late adopters and the laggards at the end, they call them. It's going from those early adopters to the early pragmatists. They're different markets with a different set of motivational drivers. The industry needs to be able to transition from this group, from the early adopters to the late adopters here, because they're a little bit lazier, they'll hang back. They really need to see a really good value proposition. My concern is if we don't get across that chasm, that gap, then we could see a bit of a stalling in the marketplace with solar and batteries at a later stage as well. So I think they're going to be some of the risks in terms of the market progressing. I think we're done for time, aren't we? That was pretty much it. I mean, the other thing I was just going to throw up there was battery warranties. This sounds really boring, right? But this is what customers look at. And a lot of the battery manufacturer warranties are really rubbery. Now, I'm sure that these will mature over time, but these kinds of things are kind of part of the kind of product as such. It's not just the battery, it's all the terms and conditions that come with it. These need to get tightened up and you need to give customers more comfort. What we don't want to see is a really rubbishy warranty where you get the early adopters getting really peeved, basically. That can have a significant impact on the market, and all of a sudden people just go, oh, I've heard Dave down the road, he had a really bad experience and you lost 5,000, you know. You can see how that can happen. So that's going to be one to watch. That's going to be another risk in the transition in the marketplace, I think. Thank you.
question? Do you have time?
I was reading the paper the other week that it's estimated Australia to transition our electricity sector is going to cost something in the order of 250 billion, and of that about half of it is in battery storage. And obviously the topic comes up about who's going to pay for this, and is it going to be a government enterprise or is it going to be individuals, as you said. Well, with distributed networks, the way I see it, this whole problem could be, well, not easily solved, but the incentive could be there to be solved if decent arbitrage opportunities were available for anyone that decides to install battery storage. I mean, a total free market for every kilowatt hour that's sold, which is sold at a price that the person sort of specifies, plus an amount to cover the distance it has to travel, would cover this. And people that are have a decent risk appetite or willing to invest the money could simply put battery storage in with the whole purpose of buying power when it's cheap and then having it on demand, ready to dispatch when it's needed.
Yep.
And with that sort of structure, you wouldn't need any of this big cumbersome legacy technologies that, apart from the stuff which distributes the power, but all of the associated paperwork and administration stuff, it would go.
Yep. I'll just make a couple of comments. I would love for that to be the case, but my experience with consumers, now we need to separate between business and domestic, and I'll start at the small end, but the domestic customers, Ausgrid had a price differential where the kind of time of use tariff was around 50 cents for the peak and shoulder was 25 cents. The uptake on that tariff has been appallingly low, almost non-existent in terms of voluntary uptake. Admittedly this is early days with batteries, but we haven't seen a lot happen there so far. Now I've got to kind of contain my comments there. What we have observed is customers are inherently lazy when it comes to this kind of stuff. And part of the problem is that electricity as a product is intangible. So when I say take out your smartphone, you can see it, you can touch it, you can taste it, you see the product, you know what it does for you. Electricity doesn't work like that. You can't really make it tangible. I couldn't tell you what a bag of kilowatt hours looks like. And in fact, it manifests in completely different ways. So lighting is completely different kind of manifestation of the product compared to the electricity and the battery usage on the computer here compared to the air conditioning. And so the mental model, the heuristic, is really messy, right? And so that makes it very difficult for consumers to conceptualise doing stuff like that. That has been a really big problem for us. In the business sector, we did a critical peak pricing trial in about 2005, and we literally we did a huge econometric study with here's the guy's name. He used to teach econometrics at Sydney. His name will come back to me. But we basically got zero response on a $2 per kilowatt hour price in the business sector. So their price profile compared to a study group didn't change. And basically what we observed there was that it's just an input cost to their business. It's not core business for them. Now that's small business customers. At the kind of medium end, there might be an opportunity there. We haven't seen a lot of behavioural change there, but they don't see themselves in that business. Now, there could be third parties that could get into this space who are not, their prime business is not being a home or a business in some other product market. They might get interested in it. So far, we haven't seen a lot of it. Now, that might be the technology's not there. The arbitrage opportunities, I will concede, are difficult to get access to because you have to register in the market, in the wholesale market. If you want to do arbitrage on tariffs, you can do that now. That's not that hard. So I think the jury's out in terms of how easy that would be to be upfront. I haven't observed it, and I think there are barriers on the wholesale side, but
yeah. But earlier you mentioned peak shaving, and that is the primary, as far as I know, for a consumer. That is the primary way that they can get a return on investment for their whatever they decide to spend. Like, for example, if they invest in a Tesla vehicle, there's limited ability for them to utilise the batteries while it's sitting there doing nothing.
Yeah.
I think we will have to leave it there, and maybe we can continue outside the discussion.
Yeah, I will just say I designed that tariff, and we did all the econometrics, and we haven't seen any behavioural change on time of use. So, I mean, I was just, you know, I put heart and soul into that, and we really pushed hard in terms of the marketing, but yeah, it doesn't work, which is really disappointing. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Chris, and for the great presentation. I think we all have a better understanding of how the market works and what the challenges are. And yeah, hopefully we have you back in maybe a year or two. Hear what you've been doing.
So I'll just ramble on. Happy to.
Thank you. Thank you very much.